So everybody, welcome to Azure DevOps Duet Hybrid Virtual Edition, a tale about how a development team and an operations team must bond together and start using Azure DevOps for data platform deployments.
So for the next 60 minutes, we'll be discussing Azure DevOps, which allows you to do the full application management lifecycle, from creating a work item all the way to its release. And we will be discussing both the cloud and on-premise versions of Azure DevOps, as well as its features, including the source control, the boards, the pipelines, artifacts, and test plans. And even though this is an Azure DevOps session, we will also mention some things about GitHub as well. And at the end of this session, you will have a basic understanding of the main features of Azure DevOps and how it can be used for your data platform deployments.
Now, to give this session some context, one of us is from the SQL development team and the other from the SQL operations team. Our managers decided that both teams will merge into one DevOps team, so that we're all one big happy family. In addition, we've been asked to make it future-proof for data engineers as well.
In reality, though, this should be a real gradual process. However, since this is only a 60-minute session, we've taken it upon ourselves to speed up this process. In addition, our manager has decided that the development team lead will be the Scrum Master and the operations team lead will be the product owner.
Now, for those of you who don't know, a product owner is responsible for translating business needs into workable backlog items for Scrum sprints, which means that they must speak to stakeholders at various levels within the business. In addition, they are ultimately responsible for prioritizing those items, even though they may get input about those priorities from various stakeholders.
And the Scrum Master's role is to empower the team to do those backlog items by encouraging how they work and removing any impediments that may appear.
Hey, Sander, before we go any further, let's introduce ourselves.
Yeah, I'm Sander. I'm a SQL Server DBA. I am a Cloud and Data Center MVP, and I'm a major contributor to the DBA Tools project, which I love to do. If you have any questions after this session, you can find me on Twitter. I'll also have a blog. You can send me an email, and all the demos you'll see today will also be available on my GitHub page. So go to my GitHub page, go to the presentations repository, and you will find this session in the list right there, and including the demos. You can use them, change them, or reteach them. Do whatever you want to do with them. They're yours to use. And now Kevin has a slightly more complicated bio than me. So go ahead, Kevin.
Well, thanks for that, Sander. And on that note, as you can see on the screen, my name is Kevin Chant. I'm a lead BI and analytics architect in the Netherlands, which is a fairly new role for me, if I'm completely honest with you. I've worked in IT since the days of Windows 95, and that's probably as much as I should say about that. For those of you who are wondering about the fact that I have this accent, even though I live in the Netherlands, I'm actually originally from the southwest of the UK. However, I live in the Netherlands due to the fact my wife is Dutch. So basically, I'm an Englishman living in the Netherlands, working for a French-based company because he met a woman in Australia. Now, whenever I say this out loud, I realise why Sandra thinks this is complicated. Now, over the years I've worked in IT, I've worked in various sectors, including the banking, oil and health insurance industries. In fact, I've supported companies that are in the top 10 of the Fortune 500 list. And I do have various certifications, including both the new and the old style MCSE. And more recently, I became a Microsoft Certified DevOps Engineer Expert, which is fairly relevant for this session. And also, I'm a Microsoft Data Platform MVP. And to save me going on for too long, just like Sander, you can contact me on various ways on social media, and I have my own blog as well. Anyway, Sander, the first thing to discuss is whether to use Azure DevOps Cloud Services or Azure DevOps Server. Now, for those who aren't aware of the difference, Azure DevOps Server is the new name for TFS, which is the application that you tend to install on premises to do your application lifecycle management. However, now it's been rebranded to look and feel just like the cloud-based Azure DevOps Cloud Services. Personally, Sander, I'd like to use Azure DevOps Server for security and reporting reasons. However, the downside is that we'd have to build one or more servers with Azure DevOps Server installed for business continuity reasons. Plus, we may have to wait a while for new features to be available because of the cloud-first strategy. In addition, we'd have to maintain and patch all those servers as well.
But if you use the Azure DevOps services in the cloud, you wouldn't have to patch and maintain anything because it's all done behind the scenes for you. And it's also easier to install extensions from the marketplace.
Well, that's true, and we can still secure it in Azure anyway. Besides, whichever we use, we must consider security and compliance to keep our auditors happy. And it's easy for us to connect Azure DevOps Cloud Services to Azure Active Directory, which we need to do if you want to connect to some services to a Git repository within Azure DevOps, like Azure Synapse Analytics. Luckily, Azure DevOps is well structured and easy to manage.
So the main point we want you to take away from this section is that if you install Azure DevOps Server, you have to patch and maintain everything yourself, whereas with the cloud-based version, everything is done behind the scenes for you. And Azure DevOps organizations need to be connected to the Azure Active Directory to easily integrate services like Synapse Studio with an Azure DevOps repository.
So now we've covered the fact that Azure DevOps is well structured, shall we actually look at it instead of just talking about it? As you can see here, Azure DevOps has its own hierarchy. At the top, you have your icon, which represents your Azure DevOps account, where your account has access to one or more organizations, which you can see on the left-hand side here in Azure DevOps. Now, these organizations can be the company that you work for, or if you work for a large enterprise, it could just be a division within that enterprise, or it can be an organization you've created yourself for testing purposes, like you can see on the left-hand side here. Now, if you have the right permissions, you can change various settings at the organization level. So, for example, in the general section, you have various settings. I won't go through every single one, but some interesting ones include being able to manage your projects and also being able to view which extensions that you have installed, and being able to connect to Azure Active Directory as well, which we've already mentioned can be quite important. You can change some various security settings. You can manage what is known as processes for Azure Boards, and we will talk about these processes later on in this session. You can manage some various pipeline settings at the organization level. As far as your repository settings are concerned, there's a couple of settings you can change here. The most interesting one is being able to change the default branch name for new repositories. Now, as some of you may be aware, there's actually a little bit of controversy relating to the origins of the master branch naming convention in Git. With this in mind, Microsoft now gives you the ability to change the default branch name. And in fact, GitHub have now taken a similar stance. If you create a new repository in there, it will be called main. And the same for the Git for Windows, Linux, etc. tools that you can install on your own computers now. And the final setting here is just to see how much space all of your artifacts across your organization is taking up. Now, if I go back to the organization homepage here, you can see that each organization can contain one or more projects. And if I click on one of these projects, you can see all the services that Sander mentioned earlier on the left-hand side there. So Azure Boards, Repos, Pipelines, Test Plans, and Artifacts. And again, just like with organization settings, if you have the right permissions, you can change various settings at the project level. So again, you have some general settings you can change. As you can see here, we've changed the image for this particular project to a graphic which may look familiar to some of you. And just to show you all some of this, because not everybody's aware, if I scroll down, you can actually turn the default services on and off for this particular project within Azure DevOps. Now, in the general section as well, there's other things like you can manage your teams, you can create service hooks so you can connect up the third-party services in the cloud. You can also do some interesting things to do with dashboards, and I do recommend you keep these as they are. In the board section, you can manage all your team configuration here. And in addition to that, you can actually use the board section here to connect up to a GitHub repository, which brings some interesting advantages if you have GitHub repositories and you want to work with Azure Boards. Now, you have pipeline settings that you can change at an organization level, including being able to manage agent pools. And we'll talk about agents later on in this session. And also other things like creating service connections. So for example, if you want your Azure pipelines to be able to connect up and do things like deploy to services in Azure, you can create connections to the accounts here. In the repository section, you can manage all of the repositories in your project if you have the right permissions. Again, you get the option to change the default name, and there's some very interesting policies that you can set as well. Again, you can view how much storage all your artifacts are taking up, but this time only at the project level. And then finally, the last default one is that you can view the retention settings for your test plans, which we'll quickly talk about at the end of this session.
Really nice. And remember, there's other things we can configure as well if you dive even deeper into these settings. So, and the main point we want you to take away from this section is how Azure DevOps is structured. Anyway, now we've covered the main admin stuff. Let's cover our version control options that we have with Azure Repos, which is a feature in Azure DevOps.
You mean like SourceSafe?
Oh, maybe something a little bit more modern, Kevin, since Azure Repo supports multiple version control systems, including Git and TFVC. So maybe something like that.
Okay, well, it'll only be for your development work though, right? Because it sounds like version control would be complicated for the ops folks to learn.
Well, actually, I think you'll see when ops teams start to use version control, and they'll actually start to perform better. At previous companies where I worked, if they started to use version control for all their scripting and their documentation, it could actually be shared along other departments or department itself in a really efficient fashion.
Well, I'm always game for more efficiency, Sander, so please tell me more.
Well, like I said, Azure DevOps supports multiple version control systems because we want to have something distributed. Git will be our best option here.
Okay, so what about branching strategies? Because I hear they're pretty important.
Yeah, they are. When you start with your Git repository, there's only one branch. You probably want a couple more. And there are a few branching strategies that you can use, like the Git flow and the GitHub flow.
Well, what's the difference between those two? Because they sound pretty similar to me.
Well, the major difference between the two is that with the Git flow, you don't directly merge into the main branch. There's always something like a development branch, unless it's a hotfix. Hotfixes tend to get merged into the main branch usually. With the GitHub workflow, there's not a development branch. There's only feature branches and there's the main branch. And each feature gets merged into the main branch after, of course, it's successfully tested. And us devs have been using source control for many years. So if we do something like pair programming, dev and ops members can actually get used to it.
Hang on a minute, peer programming.
No, pair programming. This where two people literally sit next to each other and write code together. And I know with the entire COVID situation and keeping your distance, this might be a challenge, but research has shown it usually takes a bit longer to do. However, you end up with more stable code and people learn new coding practices better.
Would that mean there's a lot of overhead involved with that practice?
Yeah, like I said, takes a bit longer to do and there's like a 15% overhead involved. But that overhead is largely compensated by the increased quality of code, which means less bug fixes. And we all know that further along test acceptance and production, bugs cost a lot of time and money. So it's probably good to think about that as well. of course, there are other methods that we can use, like code reviews. And at the end of the day, we just have to experiment and figure out what works best for us.
Okay, so what's to stop somebody coding their own release and pushing it straight to the main
Oh,
branch?
yes, important. So uh, it looks like Azure DevOps has something called branching policies that we can use. One of which is that two people have to approve updates to the main branch. And so we could probably use that.
I thought you were going to say something else for a moment there.
No.
Anyway, that does sound good. I think we need to do that to be SOX compliant anyway, since we deal with financial data. In fact, let's quickly go back into Azure DevOps now and see how we can do that. So, as Sander kind of mentioned earlier, Azure Repos is basically, if you go into it through this way, you can visualize your Git and Team Foundation version control repositories, as you can see here. And you have various features in Azure Repos, which you can see on the left-hand side. So you can view the files, you can view the commit history, any pushes that have been done, all the branches that have been used for your repository, tags. So this is exactly the same as using the git tag command. So you can put in there anything that's significant. And as you can see here, hybrid virtual group is pretty significant. And you can view any pull requests as well. Now, part of being SOX compliant is that you have to have the full I principle in place. And in order to do that in Azure DevOps, we have to create what's known as a branch policy. So if I go into click the ellipsis and straight into the branch policies here, you can see that I can do various things. For the full I principle, two people need to review the pull request. So I have to set the minimum number of reviewers to 2. And then to enforce the pull request, I have to automatically include reviewers. So if I click on the plus side, I can select myself and Sander here. And that's how you would do it, Sander.
Okay, so and these are the main points we want you to take away from this part about Azure repos. Azure DevOps supports multiple version control systems, including Git and TFVC. However, Git has become the de facto standard nowadays. So if you have the choice, just go with Git because it's free and it's out there and easy to use. In addition, you can secure your updates using branching policies, as you've seen Kevin just demonstrate, and Git hooks in really nicely with other tools from Microsoft like Visual Studio and Azure Data Studio.
Yeah, and you'll see demos about that later on. Anyway, we better discuss Azure Boards since I'm going to be using it to organize our backlog items. Now, Azure Boards is the service within Azure DevOps that you can use to manage your work items. It can use basic Agile Scrum or CMMI templates for each project that you create in Azure DevOps. As you saw earlier when I went through the organization settings, these templates are also called a process. Now, Sander, because we are using Scrum, we're going to want to use a project based on a Scrum process. For now, we can keep it as standard, but we can customize these processes if we need to. For example, we can add additional columns to our work items. So if we go back to Azure DevOps, I can just quickly go through the default features in Azure Boards for you. So you have work items, which allows you to view all of your work items in a linear format. And I actually quite like this because you can go through and find removed work items easily. Following on from there, you have backlogs, which allows you to view all of your outstanding backlog items. Very useful, especially if you work with Scrum. And I just kind of missed one. I hope not many people realize that. And you actually have boards as well, which allows you to work in a Kanban or Scrumban kind of way. A bit like what you have been able to do in the past with other board management systems. Now, for those of you who work with sprints, you can actually click on sprints here to open up by default the sprint task board, where you can work with all your backlog items and the various tasks for them moving from left to right. And then finally, you have queries, and this can be very powerful. It allows you to query all of your work items. So you can look for various things. For example, as you can see here, I've got an example of a product backlog item which doesn't have a certain tag. If I click on the editor, you'll see a query designer, which probably looks a bit familiar to those of you who have worked with query designers of various database systems over the years.
I have a question, Kevin.
What's that?
Can you explain how the backlog items are organized for Scrum?
Sure. So if we go back to backlogs and I click down here to go to epics, and I can show you the hierarchy a bit easier using this. So if you're using the Scrum process, the hierarchy by default is that you have one or more epics, which can have one or more features, which can then contain one or more product backlog items, which of course, when you're working on in the sprint, you tend to have tasks for. Now, if you were to use the agile process instead, standard, the hierarchy would actually be slightly different. It would actually be epics and then features and then user stories by default. And again, all of this can be customized as well if you really want to in Azure Boards.
Nice.
By the way, on that note, did I mention all the analytics and preview features you can potentially use with this?
Steady on, Kevin. We only have 60 minutes.
Okay, well, on that note, then I just very quickly want to show that if I go back in Azure DevOps here, well, if it lets me go back into it anyway. In Azure DevOps, we can use these things called analytics views. And you can think of these a bit like SQL Server views to a degree. And these are actually views that you use to query what's inside Azure Boards. So basically all information about your backlog items. And what you can do with these individual data sets is actually use them in Power BI. So as you can see here, I've actually put the information in Power BI report. So I've mimicked a sprint review to a degree. So I've got a burn down chart and a matrix with a slicer here. And something else which is recently been released into Power BI Desktop is that there's actually now a GitHub connector and preview. So if you're using Azure Boards along with GitHub repositories, you could actually create a report that shows information from both. And I just wanted to quickly cover that here. Anyway, the main thing we want you to take away from this section is that Azure Boards is a very powerful way of managing Scrum or Agile work visually, especially if you're a product owner.
Cool. So let's talk about Azure Pipelines, which is where we'll look to build and deploy our deliverables.
Indeed. And before we get too far started into that, let's just quickly go through the default features that you tend to get with Azure Pipelines. So obviously Azure Pipelines is the main idea of Azure Pipelines is to help you do your build and release of items through deployment pipelines. And here you do it using the pipelines feature within Azure Pipelines. Maybe a bit confusing, but there is a bit of history behind the reason why it's called pipelines. And that's mostly due to the fact it's now being changed to also cater for YAML pipelines. Following on from there, so you have pipelines that manages all your pipelines. You have environments, so you can create separate environments for example, production and test environments. You can manage things like approval gates, etc. Then you have releases, which is basically the legacy release mechanism that's GUI based and is still in use by some companies. You have libraries, and this is where you create variable groups, and this basically groups of variables that you can put together and can be reused in separate pipelines. A similar concept is task group. If you have similar tasks that you use repeatedly in different pipelines, you can group them all together here. And finally, there's deployment groups. Again, this is where you can group servers together for logical deployments. They all have to have a copy of an agent running on them. This is kind of legacy now to a degree. It's still in use in some places, but a lot of places are now moving away from using this mechanism. Anyway, now I've covered the default features in Azure Pipelines. I have a question for you, Sander, and I want to know how this would work with SQL Server deployments.
Well, the first thing we need to do is to look to deploy using either state-based or migration-based deployments. So state-based is, let's make it as something to do with traveling. So if you go and travel, state-based would be your destination of your journey. You would start at one point and then compare what you have to do. So you would have your project and then your target server, and then would compare everything, and then the entire changes will be deployed in one go. With migration-based, it's more the journey itself towards the destination. So you start at one point and then you gradually get changes and you get new scripts, and those are implemented incrementally. And there's a huge debate on whether or not to use state-based or migration-based, and there are loads of articles on the internet whether or not which one would be best for your environment. So that is an entire session on its own. But in our case, I think state-based would be better for us, just because the way we deploy our code to one of our servers. And it's actually pretty easy to do to create a state-based solution, which I will go and demonstrate right now. So people who know me know that I am pretty lazy when it comes to repetitive or mundane tasks, especially when it is something like creating a lot of Visual Studio projects and creating all kinds of a project within it. So what I did was I created a template using the PS module development PowerShell module, which enables me to create a template from an entire directory structure, including all the files and replacing values within those files. So after some tinkering, I was able to create a template out of that. And there's all the code in this little script, but the most important one is actually the invoke psmd template. All the other stuff up there is downloading the template from GitHub, extracting it, and all those kind of things. And if I run that, so if I create my SSDT project, it's going to download that from GitHub, extract it, and then create my project, and now, or my solution. And now I have my solution ready to go. And actually, this is the entire thing you want. So when I open that with Visual Studio, and this takes a couple seconds because it's going to build some things, you can see that it has two projects within it. One is the data. Unit testing is the name of my project, and the other one is tests, and the data is just for the data model, and this one would include my unit tests as well. And from here I can just do an import of the database, so I can select a connection. So this is my unit testing database. I want to just have object and start. And this takes a couple seconds. And now I have, this is just a demo database, by the way, some random generated tables and store procedures. Now I have all my objects in here, and I don't have to do anything in the other project because this project is referenced in this one as well. So this is how easy I can create an SSDT solution within a couple seconds. That's it, Kevin.
That's good. Do you want to tell us all about how to do unit tests for SQL Server?
Oh, yeah, that's cool. Well, this is another one of the things I created, was that I created something called the tSQLt test generator. So when I wanted to create basic unit tests, I want to know if my objects existed, like the tables, the store procedures, the views, the user-defined data types. So I want to know if all my objects were present in the database like I expected them to be. So with unit testing, you do these kind of things, like you expect something to happen and then you test for that. And I use tSQLt for all my unit testing for SQL Server because, first of all, it's free, and Second of all, it keeps the developer in its tSQL bubble. They don't need to learn another language like C# or PowerShell with Pester to do any unit testing. They can just use tSQL. But if you want to create like a lot of different kind of tests, which are kind of standard and could be iterated through, I thought to create a module for that. And this one, what it will do is it will look at your current state of your database, collect all the objects, and then create all the tests for it, including the object existence, table columns, if it has the correct data type and length and all those kind of things. But the same for store procedure parameters, views, all those kind of things. And this module is available on the PowerShell gallery and it's free for you to use. So if I run that, it will look at my database, and in a couple seconds we'll see that it starts to generate unit tests for me. It actually does it pretty fast. And if I go back, I can just go in my project and say add existing item. Go to my test basic, because of course in my demo I made this run and then write into this correct folder. And if I add that, and hopefully this time my Visual Studio does not crash, you can see that I have a bunch of different tests, including collation, because I want to be sure that I have the correct collation. Does my table exist? So it does, it checks for this table. Does it have correct columns? All these kind of things are iterated through. It's all done in one swoop. So you can just start and use start using unit testing, which is really important and in my opinion is not done enough. So that is unit testing for you, Kevin.
Well, that's good. And I've seen, and I did mention earlier as well, that we can either use GUI tasks using the classic editor or YAML for our pipelines. Which should we use?
Well, I think YAML, because now the GUI is good for exploring things when you first start using anything like pipelines. But I think the GUI is only available in Azure DevOps, and even GitHub doesn't have a GUI for their version of the pipelines. And by the way, if you use my template, there's already an Azure Pipelines YAML file for you to use, and also a GitHub version of that, which already includes testing and your project for SQL Server 2017 and SQL Server 2019. So you don't have to do that all by yourself. It's already there. So
that's good. And that actually kind of seamlessly ties in with what I was doing, was you're explaining to everybody about your generator and tSQLt. So what I actually did, I actually took your pipeline and I actually made a few changes whilst you were busy explaining things to everybody. So what I'm just going to do now, I've just made a change to my local copy of the repository, which of course you can do quite easily with Git, and change using Azure Data Studio, as you can see here. So I'm using the source control in Azure Data Studio just to synchronize the changes with the repository that's in Azure DevOps. So if we go back into Azure DevOps now and go to pipelines, and I click on here, and you can already see it's spinning, and there is indeed a pipeline being deployed. So if I just click on here, and I can scroll down and show you what I did. So I took your original pipeline that was being created, and I actually removed the SQL Server 2017 unit tests because I didn't need them. What I then did from there, if I go back up here, you can see I actually added to your pipeline to deploy to 3 SQL Server 2019 instances to represent integration, staging, and production environments. Now, for those who aren't aware, integration is where you tend to do your integration test. Staging is where you tend to do user acceptance tests, and then of course your production environment. and those three are running inside Docker containers locally, as you can see here in Docker dashboard. And deploying to those all worked well. So I thought, well, since they all worked, I'll test deploying a copy, synchronizing a copy of the repository in Azure DevOps with a GitHub repository. So if I needed to, I could deploy things using GitHub Actions as well. And that worked fine. So then I thought to myself, well, okay, that worked. What about if I want to take a copy of the actual database project and actually change it to be able to deploy to different versions of SQL Server related databases in Azure? So first of all, I tested deploying to Azure SQL database. So all I had to do, and if I hopefully can show you here, is essentially I just made a secure copy behind the scenes of your repository. So the project that Sander showed you just now, there's a separate copy of that on the server that did all the work for the deployment. I then changed one line of code in the SQL project file to change the target, the database schema provider, so that it's ready to create a DAT pack for an Azure SQL database instead. Once that was changed, I then created the DAT pack as a separate artifact and published it as well in the pipeline. And that actually worked for Azure SQL database. So I thought, well, since that works, I'll be a bit more adventurous and I'll try it for an Azure Synapse Analytics dedicated SQL pool. And that actually worked as well. So obviously this is running live at the moment and tends to be a bit slower. So let's go to one that I've already did earlier, Sander. And if I scroll down here, you can see here is a completed pipeline with the 4 different artifacts, which are actually different DAT packs to deploy to different SQL Server related databases.
I think it's so cool that we can do tSQLt tests on a database project that will end up as a dedicated SQL pool. It just takes a bit of imagination. Plus, you have to take the SQL pool schema into consideration as well. Of course, for these kind of deployments, you can use PowerShell instead of from your YAML to handle your deployments if we're dealing with a large number of servers.
Well, how do we know if using APIs with PowerShell worked?
Well, we could simply get PowerShell to output the XML in the same format as the JUnit test results, and then allow Azure DevOps to use the XML in a task which publishes the results to view the results visually. Of course, we can put other feedback mechanisms in place for deployments as well.
We can do that?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. So if we go to edit a pipeline like we saw earlier, are we limited to the tasks that we see on the right-hand side?
Well, actually, we're not. In fact, you can install loads of additional extensions from the marketplace to add more tasks. Of course, because we are an enterprise company, we may have to request permissions so we can install them instead of being able to install them straight away, which is something you usually do with whichever team manages Azure DevOps for the entire enterprise.
I didn't realize that was a thing.
Oh, yes. But it does mean we can get help with those security and compliance issues you were talking about earlier. Plus, I get the feeling we also have to install the Synapse Workspace deployment extension anyway. Because I know you've already asked if it's possible to redeploy Workspace artifacts to another one. And from what you mentioned, you can do that, right?
Yeah, and in fact, Microsoft actually provides on how to do it. Anyway, moving on from there, I've seen that we can use Microsoft hosted agents even within our own network on premises. We try the service that Microsoft hosts in Azure to do a lot of the processing of the build and release tasks in Azure Pipelines, like building various artifacts and deploying them as I showed just now. However, it appears that because of our infrastructure standard, we'd have a lot of issues internally. For example, we'd have to raise a lot of firewall requests.
Well, maybe, but remember, a lot of us are developers and we don't want to build our own servers. Plus, we have to figure out exactly what software to install on those agents. I mean,
So
nice.
just so everybody can see here, if you do want to build your own agents internally, Microsoft actually provides a guide on how to do this. If you're confused about the name, it's because you can actually use the same images to create GitHub action runners as well.
If we're going to do that, we might as well run the agent through the command line instead of using it as a service.
How come?
Well, everybody knows that when running something through the command line, you get more detailed results, right?
Okay, well, as you know, I tested it earlier. So do you want to see the results on the next slide?
Yes, please. There's not much there, Kevin.
Mm-mm. You want to quickly move us away from this one,
Yeah.
I'm guessing.
Yeah, next part.
Right, so let's go straight to test plans.
Yes, shall we? So, of course, we can do test plans once we've done the initial build and release before we release somewhere else.
They all have to be automated though, because that would take a lot of effort for some items.
Not necessarily. Your test plans can have manual steps as well, which you can test out for yourself because we have something like that, right?
We do indeed. So what I can do is go to test plans in Azure DevOps. So rather conveniently, everybody here is a test plan that we created earlier. And if I move this over a bit, and I can actually select the test plan that we've created and click on one for web application. And as you can see, the test plan actually appears here in a new window or web application as such. And within this test plan, you can see I can do various things. I can click on the ticks. If something's fine, I can hover over any images to zoom into them to save me opening up the images directly. If something doesn't work, I can click on the cross and just say something along the lines it's broke. From there, if something doesn't work, I can click on create bug to create a bug in Azure Boards. Other things I can do as well, I'm just going to discard the actually, what I forgot to show you there, you scroll down, you can see it'll include any failed text that you add in. And we will discard those changes. And we can take snapshots of anything on the screen. If I click on the ellipsis here, you can see we can also do a few other things like record the screen with audio. Now, there is actually an application you can install to use with test plans instead of using the web application. However, it does seem to only want to open on your main screen. So if you're using multiple screens, you may have to change your display settings. And there's some other interesting things that you can do for your test plans as well. I do recommend looking further into test plans and doing experiments with them. Anyway, now we've covered test plans to an extent. Over to you, Sander.
So we better briefly discuss artifacts here, which is where we can share various things like NuGet packages with others. For example, if you create a NuGet package, you can share it within Azure Artifacts for others to use. So to help remove some jargon for you, Azure Artifacts uses feeds, and a feed is basically a source that people can access to download packages, which can be online somewhere or on your network. And for Linux-oriented people, it's basically a repository. And these feeds can be configured to host various packages, package types, including NuGet, NPM, Maven, Python, and also universal packages.
Yep, so I can quickly show you now how artifacts look in Azure DevOps. So basically, you have your various feeds here. This is a feed based on universal packages, which basically can be any file type essentially. We've used it here for the DBA Tools PowerShell module. If I click on here, I have some syntax that I can copy and then run locally on my machine if I want to be able to download the contents of this artifact into its own folder on my laptop if I really want to. However, for the benefit of time, because it can sometimes take a while, I will leave this for now. Now, as I mentioned, universal packages can be various different file types, and it's recommended for large binary files. And in fact, it's been tested up to 1 terabyte in size. At the moment, it does appear to be a slight issue with publishing artifacts using your own account. So I do recommend if you are looking to do that from your own machine, then log in to using the Azure CLI with what's called a PAP token as an authentication token, basically, instead of your own Azure account. So to be honest, I know there's other features in Azure DevOps I'm looking forward to the team using as well. So if I just quickly go back over to the overview here, and you remember everybody at the start of the session, I recommended not to change the dashboard settings. And the reason being is because I quite like dashboards. And if you're working in a DevOps related way, they can be very useful. For example, you can show a dashboard like this at the start of your daily stand-up every day. So you can remind your entire team what the sprint goal is and view all essential metrics for it. We've got a very bad sprint burn down chart here, so maybe don't look at ours for this one, but usually you would see the sprint burn down with a downwards trend during your sprint.
Don't forget the wiki.
Well, that's true. So I click on here, everyone, you can see there's a wiki you can use if you've got things like a way of working documented. You may want to put it in Azure DevOps as well, so it's close to the service that everybody's going to be using. That's my personal preference anyway. Of course, there's the analytics views feature that we can use as well. Where I showed you earlier, you could use it for reports in Power BI. You may be keen to know as well, Sander, it's actually an Azure DevOps extension for CLI we can use. So we can test using that as an alternative to the portal. And it's useful as well for other companies which have certain limitations as far as Azure portal access is concerned or deploying using the Azure portal. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to all that. Anyway, just want to make sure that you confirm what we've covered in this last 60 minutes, Sandra, if that's okay. Yeah. So we're going to be using the following services and features within Azure DevOps. Hopefully we both agree on that. We're going to use Azure Boards to manage our work items. Moving on from there, we're going to use Azure Repos for our repositories, which will actually feed information back to Azure Boards, which is why the arrows 2 goes both ways. From there, we're going to use Azure Pipelines for our CI/CD deployments. And as part of our strategy as well, we're going to use Azure Artifacts to manage our packages, which we can actually work with in line with Azure Repos and obviously Azure Pipelines as well. And like we covered a few minutes ago, we will then finally do our manual tests using Azure Test Plans. And if there's an issue like the diagram shows here, we will feed it back as bugs for work items in Azure Boards. Remember as well, by the way, everybody, as we talked about earlier, you're eligible to create your own Azure DevOps organization to test things on. If you have your own Visual Studio subscription, it can bring additional benefits as well.
So that is just in case you want to test out things without the fear of breaking anything in your company's Azure DevOps organization. So now we've covered all that information, all these things. Where shall we begin?
Well, I suggest we start by getting both teams together and explain to them what we're trying to achieve to get everybody on board.
Cool. So,
oh, I forgot something, sorry.
Uh-oh.
I forgot to mention about using Power BI for the metrics.
Uh-oh.
And we should also mention that to the team when we're trying to get them on board.
Yeah, important. So anyway, that's all we've got time for today, folks. We have a couple minutes left, and so let us know in the chat if you have any questions.
And whilst we're waiting to answer questions, just a big thank you for everybody who attended this session. And as promised earlier in the session, here are our contact details again. in case you want to reach out to either of us.
Okay, great. So thank you guys for that. It was excellent. I think it must be my third time seeing the session, mustn't it? I must be your record attendee.
How much has it changed in those 3 times? Because this is very different from a lot of previous times we've done it.
Yeah, we're slowly seeing more of a new functionality coming in, aren't we? So I suspect in another year it will be even more different, the way things are changing.
Yeah.
Yes.
We kind of change it every single time because new features get released and all those kind of things. So.
Yeah.
And we have new ideas as well for the session. Like one particular slide, which was brand new for this particular session.
Yeah. Cool. Let's go straight to questions. The first one, Mikkel has nicely lined up for me, and I think it's going to be the most complicated one for me to say, so bear with me. So within Azure DevOps, you can create multiple organizations, multiple projects, multiple teams, multiple wikis, repos, and so on. Is there any good reason why you might use multiple organizations over a single one to store your projects, or even multiple projects over a single project?
Oh, definitely. As far as there's 2 separate parts to that question, essentially, that need to be explained to a degree. As far as the decision whether or not to create multiple projects, for example, a project for each team, depends on the number of teams you want to work in a project, and you've got to finally balance it out. It can make sense that if you're working, for example, using SAFe, which is a scaled agile framework, to have multiple teams using the same project. However, you have to have a balance between number of teams on a project and the amount of administration you want to do for your Azure DevOps project, because the more teams you add to one single project, the more administration you're going to do as far as organizing everybody's permissions in that project is concerned. And I hope that makes sense for everybody. And the second part about one or more organizations is, well, there's a couple of very easy answers to that. First of all, if you want to test things yourself, then you are better off creating your own organization and testing things in there. However, as far as creating one or more organization for companies is concerned, Azure DevOps is not a limitless service, but it does have tipping points. It has limits. Those limits are actually documented online. If you go to your favorite search engine and you type in Azure DevOps limits, you will find out all about them. I do know that at least one particular company actually hit some interesting limits to do with things like APIs, etc. So you have to look at them, because the organizations there, there's limits on projects, there's limits on how many processes you should ideally use, etc. And I hope that answers that question for everybody.
Cool. Next question would be, if you accidentally select the wrong project type, for example, Scrum, how easy is it to swap over to a different project type without breaking the boards, items, pipelines, anything you have?
Not extremely, and it also depends on how long you've been using that project as well.
Kind of forever.
If you've been using it for the kind of forever and you want to move it, the problem is that there's different columns and the different processes, and they will not migrate over to the different process easily. So my big advice to anybody that is creating a new Azure DevOps project is to try and get your process right. Select it right at the start. And one thing you can do is make a copy of one of the default processes you get in Azure DevOps, and then actually customize that copy of a process. And that's very common practice in a lot of enterprises. They will actually make copies for people to be able to customize for their projects. So yeah, it's troublesome.
So the old saying goes, undisputed again, if you don't have time to do it right the first time, when do you have time to do it again?
Right. Let's assume my DBA is a very angry man, doesn't like to give security rights out. So for database build and release pipelines, what security context do I get him to enable so that I can deploy my projects under that?
well, you kind of don't deploy them yourselves. So if you have your pipelines, you let the pipeline do that for you. So it's all automated. So the developers don't need direct access to all the to those environments. As soon as you go from test to acceptance, that should all be handled by the Azure DevOps process and then be released using either the pipeline or a release, actual release. And then the DBA doesn't have to get angry at all with the developers. So I think that's a win-win.
Yeah, and adding to that as well, obviously you want to make sure everything's with the permissions of least restricted. You want to make sure that whatever you do with your pipelines to update the SQL Server databases, first of all, make sure you're going to be doing your testing and make sure you deploy it on a per environment basis, ideally. And obviously the most important part about this whole process is to make sure your DBA is on board at the start and works with you whilst you're working this way. Because the more confidence they have, the less angry they are going to be.
And remember, implementing DevOps is not something you do right from the start. It's like a gradual process. So you try to find all your things you do manually and then try to automate them in your pipelines to make the entire deployment process work for your company. So I've noticed that people try to do it right the first time and then actually find out that it's not working smoothly for them. Let's say that, because it's not how they are used to deploy their things. And you should actually make sure that Azure DevOps works for you.
Good. So we have an easy yes or no question, but obviously we are all hoping for dates. Are we ever likely to see an easy way to switch between classic and YAML pipelines back and forth?
It's kind of already there to a degree. That the easy way, which most people are recommending, is just to get the YAML from your classic pipelines basically and put them into a new YAML one. It's the same goes for releases as well. That is the recommended practice. I've not seen a quick button to please move this straight away into a YAML pipeline. You do have to go and click in to get the YAML code to do it.
But it is a one-way operation.
Yeah, and yep. To be honest, it should be, to be honest. It is kind of, you can think of it as legacy now. I know a lot of companies still use the release mechanism. However, the recommended route now is to use YAML pipelines, just to be very clear about that.
Okay.
And
Good.
again, if you want to have an example how you can make that work, if you use one of the demos that I showed you earlier, it already has a YAML pipeline already set up for you. So it's, when you dive into it, it's actually not that hard to switch over to YAML. And if you use the extensions from the marketplace, everything you already put in there is converted to YAML. So you don't have to write everything yourself.
It is more of the militia company policy issue. We need everything to be classic pipelines, and I need to write something in YAML. But that would never work then. So are we ever likely to see the way to switch? No. Use YAML.
What companies? Yeah, if this is from, as you say, coming from a large enterprise, you would actually find they have retention policies in place, so you can't actually remove the releases anyway. So yeah, the best practice is to just create the new YAML pipelines and just leave the releases where they are. Just make sure that the triggers are off, and that's it effectively. because if you are a part of a large enterprise and you have been using these releases, like I said, you will have to keep them there for your auditors if they're touching production.
Right. Okay. Well, we've got another quite convoluted question, so I'll do my best with it. Do you have any guidance as to whether I release my code in release pipelines using one or more stages, or multiple tasks in a stage, or even one or more tasks in one or more jobs in a stage? Hopefully you understand what I'm suggesting there.
I am indeed.
Good.
I do. I've kind of been asked a similar question before. I could give the classic SQL answer here of it depends. To be honest with you, using the stages, it does, first of all, depends on the number of whatever it is you're deploying. So for example, like X amount of SQL Server databases, and it makes sense to split them into separate stages if you're doing something like using a Chant-based deployment strategy and you're doing so many servers at a time. It also makes sense as well to do different stages if you're deploying to different environments, like you saw me do this evening in the demo. Also to different types of services as well. If you're doing a bunch of tasks together, which makes sense for them all to be done together, like for example, as you saw, where I basically built the database project to become a DAT pack and then had it published, all of that makes sense to be put within one stage. So it does actually, like I said, it depends on the scale and the logic as well.
Yeah.
It really, it kind of, yeah, like I said, it does depend. It makes very much sense for the stages to be for different environments. And also the scale. If you're using something like Chant-based deployment, if you're deploying to so many servers at a time, then it makes sense to do those in separate stages. And the reason I said about the environments, and that reminds me, thank you very much to myself for reminding me about that, is to do with your environment settings as well, because you want to put your approval gates for the different in for the different stages ideally. And you can get to see the visibility of that when your pipeline is running. It will flag up and say, I need your approval for this particular stage because there is a release gate there. So I hope that answers the question. I understand the question was a bit convoluted. I've been asked something similar. A lot of the time, I say it's to do with how you're doing your deployments and the numbers and the different environments, etc.
Yeah, I think your "it depends" was actually quite accurate.
Yeah.
Okay.
Cool. So the final question would be, if we're doing this from scratch because we were so happy with what you demoed, do we do this in Azure repos, or could we do it in the plain normal GitHub?
Do both.
Yeah.
Again, it depends what you want to do. You can use GitHub for just the repositories. You can use the GitHub Actions for your CI/CD workflows. And then you can use, for instance, we have a session about that, don't we, Kevin?
We do indeed.
That
I
we
was
actually
going to mention that.
Yeah, so you can combine those. I think for GitHub is still a bit away for project organization. It's not there yet. Azure DevOps is a lot better in that aspect. But GitHub is very strongly in the repository section, and they're developing a lot of stuff on the CI/CD side as well, kind of faster than Azure DevOps in my opinion. But yeah, you can even let them work together. It depends on what you want to do.
You can mix and match, and that's the thing with Azure DevOps. You don't have to use all of the services. If you've got existing services you want to still use, you can integrate those with various parts in Azure DevOps. for example, like Sander said, the existing GitHub repositories. You can actually use those existing GitHub repositories of Azure Pipelines if you really want to. However, like Sander said, you do have GitHub Actions now. Obviously, Azure Boards has got a rich number of features inside it. I know that GitHub have recently announced GitHub issues. However, there is a bit of a wait list just to get onto the preview program for that at this moment in time. So you probably still want to use Azure Boards. And to be honest with you, you can only use Azure Test Plans if Azure Boards is enabled for your project anyway. So I hope that answers it a bit more for everybody.
Yes, perfect. Thank you for answering our questions, delivering the session. Thanks everybody for joining us, and a very big thanks to Kevin and Sander.
You're welcome. It was fun.
It was.